Vermicomposting is one of the best things that you can do for your garden because you're creating optimal, top quality organic fertilizer, and you're also closing the loop with your food scraps. And in this video, I'm going to share with you how to put together a very simple and affordable vermicomposting system using plastic bins. This video has 4 main sections. First, we're going to talk about your vermicomposting system as an ecosystem. Next, we're going to talk about the structure of your system, which is what kind of bin you're going to select to host your worms. Next, we're going to talk about best practices to optimize worm nutrition and avoid some of the common problems caused by overfeeding. And lastly, we're going to talk about what are those key variables that you want to get as right as possible for your worm system to become a living, thriving ecosystem. I have been vermicomposting for the last 10 years, and I have kept vermicomposting bins indoors as well as outdoors. I have lived in Southern California in a very hot climate where I kept composting systems going outdoors all year long. And now that I live in New York and I have a homestead in Vermont, I continue to vermicompost. Your vermicomposting system is a community of living organisms working together, interacting with each other to break down the food scraps that you're adding to your system. In order for you to optimize the conditions of your whole system, it's key that you start thinking about your worm bin as a living ecosystem. Because when you add food scraps to the bin, it is not the worms alone who are eating the food scraps. It's the whole system what's responsible for the digestion of the food scraps that you add to the system. As a matter of fact, worms don't eat food scraps. What they do is they eat the microbiology that starts to colonize and break down the food scraps that you are adding to your system. It's the nematodes, the protozoans, the bacteria, the fungi, all of these entities, even the mites that sometimes show up uninvited to your bin, all of them are working to break down all of that material. When you support different communities of living organisms inside of your bin, and when you foster a balanced interaction of those organisms when not one particular species is able to outcompete the others, that's when you create a thriving ecosystem that is well balanced and that is resilient, meaning that is able to withstand different stressors. It may be a spike in acidity, or you're going through a heat wave and you're trying to support your system. All of the different organisms in the system and the structure of the system itself should support the well-being of the system as a whole. Please do me a favor, please click like and subscribe to my channel and share this video with people that may benefit from getting this information. Because what I'm trying to share with you is tools and frameworks that will allow you to think through different challenges, to troubleshoot issues, and to build a system that is strong and resilient. The best way to support the microbiology inside of your vermicomposting system and to foster biodiversity is to balance the different variables that impact the health and the well-being of your systems. These variables are carbon to nitrogen ratio, humidity, acidity, temperature, and airflow. Carbon to nitrogen ratio being one of the most important functions because it really supports everything else that happens inside of your bin. Your carbon to nitrogen ratio is the foundation of the health of your system, and that is 70% carbon to 30% nitrogen, or 50 parts of carbon per 1 part of nitrogen. Nitrogen is your food scraps, is the green stuff, the green materials, what we consider the green material in regular composting. And the brown material is the bedding, whether you're using coco coir or leaves or hay or cardboard or paper, that is your brown material. So the bulk of your vermicomposting system should be brown material because that really helps you stabilize everything within your system. And remember, carbon really is the foundation of life on this planet. Carbon is responsible for stabilizing the temperature of the entire planet. Carbon constitutes the foundation of most living tissues, and nitrogen is more of a catalyst. It really accelerates everything inside of your bin. So carbon to nitrogen ratio is not only the foundation of your vermicomposting system, but it's also the one factor that limits how much food you can add to your bin. Because if you want to have a healthy bin, you really need to stay as close as possible to the 70% carbon, 30% nitrogen. You can add as much food scraps to your bins as you want, so long as you can double down with 70% more carbon material. There is different bins available in the market. You have the towers that you stack the system. Some people are using bags. I have been vermicomposting with plastic bins for almost 10 years, and by far this is my favorite system, and I'm going to explain why. First of all, this is very affordable. Ideally, you want to buy two of the same size because in my experience, it's really nice when they are able to really encase into each other. Now, if you're going to use different bins, you want to use the strongest bin in the bottom because we have the tendency to pull it by the handles, and if it's a poor quality bin, it's going to come apart fairly soon. Another thing that I love about the tote bin system is that this is scalable. When I was living in California, I had an outdoor vermicomposting system. I had 3 very big vermicomposting bins where I recycle 100% of my food scraps. I got a new job and I had to relocate to the Midwest, and I went right into an apartment on the 20th floor in the Gold Coast in Chicago. And I could no longer bring my 3 big composting bins from California. So what I did, I bought the smallest plastic bins that I could find at the store, and I created a very small vermicomposting system that will allow me to continue to provide my household plants with the best organic fertilizer. Because let me tell you, when I relocated from California to Chicago, I brought 2 suitcases, one with my clothes and the other one with my plants. Let me explain how this works. So you have 2 bins. The top bin is where you're gonna keep your worms. So the first thing you wanna do is you wanna drill holes. You wanna drill holes on the bottom because this is what's gonna allow the excess fluids to drain. And you also wanna drill holes especially around the top, because this is the area that is going to be exposed to air. So you want air circulation as part of your vermicomposting system. Air circulation is one of the most important things. So you definitely, right from the get-go, you want to make sure you have good air circulation. If you're concerned about roaches or other critters getting into your system, you can use the smallest bit on a drill to drill as many holes as you want. You really want good airflow, but you don't want them so big that the system is going to dry, or that you're going to have problems with insects going in and out of your bin. Then you also want to consider drilling holes on the top. Drill holes in one of the lids, and then with the second lid you have it as a cover for those holes, and still there is enough space for some moisture to escape. So this is another reason why I like having 2 bins of the same size, because then that second lid, I can really use it as a rain cover for my bin. Let me talk about the lower bin. Because in my experience, vermicomposting, the lower bin really made the biggest difference for me. When I first started vermicomposting, I just drill holes in one bin, put it down, I'll put something to collect the excess fluids if there were excess fluids, and that was my system. However, when I had to take my system indoors, having excess fluids flowing out of a vermicomposting system was not the greatest thing to have. So at one point, I discovered that you could use a second bin. Now, the game changer here is not only having a second bin, but filling these 2/3 of the volume with wood chips. The wood chips are gonna soak all the excess humidity that flows down. I usually replace my wood chips about once a year, once they're saturated. One of the benefits of having a bottom bin filled with wood chips is that much carbon also contributes to the carbon to nitrogen ratio of your bin. Now, that doesn't mean you get to fill the top bin only with foods because you have a full bin of wood chips in the bottom. No, you still have to be mindful of that 70-30% ratio on your top bin. But when it comes to the lower bin, because all of that carbon, you're not adding any food scraps in there, that really helps you buffer that ratio. It keeps things really nice, it keeps the temperature more stable, and it also gives your worms a whole new environment to play. So don't freak out if your worms start going down there, because some worms will be there all the time. They never come out. Like, there are worms that just take residence in the lower bin. But if things in the top bin remain stable and the carbon to nitrogen ratio is healthy and there's good airflow and you're being mindful of what you feed your worms and you're not overfeeding them, they will naturally come up and feed, and it will be a very dynamic and rich ecosystem. Because what you want to establish is an ecosystem. You don't want to just have a bin where you throw your food scraps. You really are creating an ecosystem. And the more biodiversity that you have inside of the bin, the richer the environment is going to be for your worms, the healthier things are going to be, and the happier you're going to be, because you're not going to have to deal with issues like smells or bugs or other things coming inside of your bin. You should not only rely on wood chips to keep the smells. You really want to manage things so you don't get smells. But having that much carbon material supporting your bin is one of the best things that you can do, especially if you're doing indoor composting. And I'm going to ask you for a favor. Please be generous with your comments, because YouTube is paying attention to engagement. So if you're getting value out of this video, please take the time to leave me a comment, say hello, let me know where you are in your vermicomposting process. Let me know if you have any questions. I get to 100% of the questions that people post. And also let me know if there's other topics that you would like me to explore with regards to vermicomposting or gardening as a whole. Let's now talk about food. Your worms don't eat food scraps or worm chow or any of the stuff that you can buy online. What your worms eat is microorganisms. So in order for you to support worm nutrition, what you need to do is to support the microbiology inside of your worm bin. And you do that by means of adding a lot of carbon, because carbon is the main source of energy for microorganisms. So the main source of food for your microorganisms is actually the bedding, it's not the food scraps. You want bedding to account for 70% of the entire volume of your vermicomposting system at any given time. You want most of your bin to be carbon, because that's really what's going to give the system stability, it's going to give your system resilience, and it's going to give the worms really the optimal chances to establish a full, rich ecosystem. There's a lot of different opinions and thoughts out in the vermicomposting community about what to feed your worms, what not to feed your worms. I personally feed my worms 100% of the vegetable matter that comes out of my kitchen. That includes onions, pineapples, and everything. I do consume a lot of pineapples by juicing. However, when you're going to start your worm bin for the first time, when you have a brand new system, please do not overload your system. You want to feed your worms things like pulp from juicers, watermelon grinds, and banana peels are really good at the beginning. With banana peels, you want to be mindful that fruit flies often lay their eggs on bananas. Some folks freeze all of their food scraps before they add them to the bin, because by freezing the food scraps, you kill a lot of the eggs and other things that may come on the vegetable peels. In my case, I don't freeze anything. What I do is I ferment a lot of my food scraps. It's something that I learned to do when I was doing a lot of indoor composting. So if you go where you think is a pound of worms and you heard somewhere that your worms are gonna be able to eat half their weight in food every day, and you start adding half a pound of food to your worm bin every day, you're gonna end up overwhelming the system and causing a lot of problems. That's when you start running into things like smells, fruit flies, insects, and attracting rodents to your vermicomposting system. What you gotta understand is that your system is not fully functioning just yet. You're just beginning to put together the pieces of what will become a very efficient ecosystem. However, it will take several months for that system to kick into gear to really start to process a lot of material really fast. What digests, what breaks down the food scraps that you're adding to the system is the entire system. The biology, the carbon, everything that is in there is doing its thing to break down the food scraps that you're adding. It's not just your worms. If you're interested in learning more about microbiology and how that impacts the nutrition of your worms, as well as things that you can do to increase the microbial diversity inside of your vermicomposting system, please check out my other video on worms and biochar. When I first started vermicomposting, one of the biggest mistakes that I made was I overfed my bin because I was so excited. I wanted to recycle 100% of my food scraps. I thought my worms were like living machines, that they were going to process all these food scraps. At one point, I put horse manure in the bin and it just heated so much that the worms just escaped. I was able to rescue those worms, and those worms eventually became my colony. So if you run into issues, don't give up, because eventually you are going to figure things out and you're going to be able to create a system that is thriving, that is efficient, and provides top quality vermicompost for your garden. So don't give up, keep at it. It takes time. All right, let's now talk about what are those key functions that determine the health of your vermicomposting system. First and foremost, there's 3 key variables that you want to monitor, which are humidity, acidity, and temperature. And the best way to make sure these variables stay within range is to stay as close as possible to the 70% carbon, 30% nitrogen ratio. At the very beginning of your vermicomposting experience, I would almost go to 90% carbon, 10% food scraps, because you're still building that microbiology. So let's briefly talk about these variables. Humidity, you want humidity to be at close to 80% in the bin, because worms need a high level of humidity to exchange oxygen with their environment. So they breathe through their skin, so they need a high content of humidity in order to breathe, to be able to move around. If you notice that your worms are clumping or that the surface of the bin is drying up, that's the time when you want to add some extra moisture. But eventually, in my experience, once things get going, a lot of the food scraps, when they break down, they produce a lot of excess fluids and you end up with excess humidity. But at the very beginning, a spray bottle is usually the best way to do it, spraying the surface, moving things around, making sure it stays cool and moist in there. Another thing that I do to make sure that I keep a steady level of humidity inside of my bin, especially at the beginning when I'm starting a new bin, is once I do everything, I put the food scraps, I put the bedding, I usually keep just a piece of cardboard right on top to prevent a lot of the humidity from escaping. Temperature is probably one of the most important things when it comes to vermicomposting, especially if you have an outside operation. Worms have a very similar temperature tolerance as human beings, so if you're hot, your worms are hot. They usually feel their best when the temperature is between 50 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. They can tolerate up to 95 degrees, but at that point, they are under a lot of stress. So you want to keep your vermicomposting system cool, and especially if you're starting a worm bin for the first time, I would definitely recommend that you keep that bin indoors in an air-conditioned environment. The way how I monitor acidity, humidity, and temperature is not by measuring them. It's just by paying attention to what's happening inside of my vermicomposting system. For example, if you have mite population explosions regularly, that's an indicator that humidity may be too high and that acidity may also be off. On the other hand, if you notice that your worms are working throughout the whole system, they move around, they gravitate towards fresh food scraps very quickly, you know your system is likely to be working well. Acidity is the pH inside of your vermicomposting system, and acidity is heavily influenced by the decomposition of food scraps. When you add a lot of fresh food scraps to your system, acidity will naturally fluctuate, it will go up, and as things start to break down, acidity will go down to a more neutral level. The recommended pH level for your vermicomposting system is usually between 5 and 9 pH level. There's 3 main things that I do to manage acidity inside of my system. Number 1, I limit the area where I introduce fresh food scraps to my whole system. So within the top bin, I usually feed roughly an area of about 1/4 of the total surface areas of the bin. So in that way, I am limiting the high acidity fluctuation to one specific area, and the remaining of the system has a more neutral, more balanced acidity and temperature, so that allows that initial uptake in acidity to remain contained to that area. That also gives worms the opportunity to go in and out of it and to go into the fresh food scraps whenever they are ready. Whenever they sense that the acidity level in that area is good, then that's when they move into that. Usually, in my experience, it takes about 3 days for that to happen. And I usually feed my worms bokashi, which is fermented food scraps, and that has a very high acidity content. Which takes me to the next thing that I do. I add a lot of eggshells to the bokashi or the fermented food scraps that I add to my system, because the calcium in the eggshells will naturally neutralize high acidity levels inside of that material. The next thing that I do is I create air pockets, because air circulation inside of your bin will naturally help you manage acidity, because in the absence of air or in the absence of oxygen, you will tend to get more anaerobic bacteria, or bacteria that lives in areas without oxygen. And when those bacteria work decomposing food scraps, they tend to generate acids as a byproduct. So the more air you have in the system, the less likelihood of creating the conditions for anaerobic bacteria or acid producing bacteria to start to proliferate. Acidity, humidity, and temperature are all impacted by carbon to nitrogen ratio and airflow. So if you get something out of this video, let it be to make sure that you stay as close as possible to that ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio of 70% carbon or bedding material and 30% nitrogen or food scraps. And do not forget about airflow, because airflow is just as important as carbon to nitrogen ratio when it comes to helping you manage temperature, acidity, and humidity.